What's up, nigga?
You're watching Fugitive Red-Eye, and welcome to another episode of OverAnalyzing, the series where I take a more in-depth look at the fictional universes which I love. And today we're diving back into Red Dwarf, because Red Dwarf content is something I haven't done in a fat minute, and I've been getting back into the show, recently watching Season 4 with my friend Theron, and having once again listened to the audiobook of Infinity Welcomes Careful Drivers. Now this is going to be a more broad sense of overanalyzing. It's not going to be as laser focused as some of the other ones, but it's been a while since I've done some Red Dwarf content, so I thought I'd do one, albeit a little bit less focused and more broad. Now this is going to have some overlap with some of the other episodes, but nevertheless, I wanted to talk about Red Dwarf and lore. Now Red Dwarf itself is a sitcom. It's primarily made as a comedy. It is a sci-fi sitcom, but the sci-fi does come secondary to the comedy. As the series went on, it did get more and more sci-fi focused, and even had little sprinkles of drama here and there with things like Back to Earth. That said, being a sitcom, which is predominantly status quo and mostly focused on the comedy, lore and consistency in the continuity has not been a primary focus of the show. The novels, on the other hand, which I did a whole sub-series of overanalyzing talking about, do have a much more coherent and consistent continuity, albeit with two separate endings, being the third and fourth books being alternative sequels, one by Rob Grant and one by Doug Naylor. But the novel continuity is a different continuity than the show continuity. Now, something of note that I like to do is I like to take elements of the novels and consider it canon, and the show seems to do this too. For instance, in Beyond a Joke, Lister mentions that Crichton killed the crew by accident on the Nova 5. That was never explicitly stated in the episode Crichton, but it was explicitly stated in the Red Dwarf novels. So because of that, we can look at that element of the novels as canon. I also like to think that the novel amount of crew is probably the canon number. The amount of crew that was on the ship has changed multiple times in the series. It was originally 169, then it was 1,169. In the novels, it's 11,169. Still actually a pretty small crew, given that the ship is the size of a fucking city. But nevertheless, it is a bigger number, so I think it makes more logical sense. Also, the sheer amount of scutters that there are in the novels makes more sense, because there's hundreds of them. Whereas in the show, we only ever saw two at a time, typically, but that was typically due to budgetary constraints. They could only have two models of them. I've already talked about the various plot holes and inconsistencies within the show, but I'll touch on it a little bit here. The year in which Red Dwarf left on its mission has changed multiple times in the series. Initially, it was 2077, and then it's been mostly in the 23rd century. However, Season 7, it's the 22nd century, and Season 7 is an outlier there. There's no others that are like that. Obviously, this is one that you can kind of overlook, because again, they're 3 million years in the future from whenever the hell they left in the first place, so it's not really that relevant, but it is still a big one. Also, there's things like stasis leak that never come up again. And there's times when they could have used other apparatus that they get, time slides, or the matter paddle, things like that they could have used to benefit them in other situations they get in, but you just gotta kind of ignore when they don't, because they need something to go that way for the plot, so for plot convenience, you just gotta kind of let those things go. But then there's the stuff to theorize about, and I've already done videos theorizing about them, things like the Alpha-Betty Spaghetti scene, where the polymorph somehow attaches its tentacle to Rimmer and drains out his anger. I already did a video talking about that already. That was literally the first episode of Overanalyzing. And of course, there was the Kachansky Conundrum, which was another Overanalyzing episode, which is just basically me wondering why the nanobots didn't resurrect the original Kachansky, when the one that's with the crew is actually not the original, she's from an alternate universe. And of course, you got big ones like, how the hell was the Season 8 cliffhanger resolved? Is the Rimmer that's with the crew currently the original Rimmer who was Ace, and did he come back and decide to revert? Or is it another hologram made with the memories of the original one, and if so, obviously then he has some of the memories of the one that was on Red Dwarf currently, and how do the memories work, how did they get merged, that kind of thing. Red Dwarf is unique in that it does change the status quo up a few times, for instance adding Crichton in Season 3, and in Season 6 and 7, them being stranded in Starbug. There's a lot of things that don't make sense that happen in a lot of these seasons, for instance Tika to Ride. The way that they're able to combine the matter paddle to go back to Earth, when that doesn't make any sense given the distance out in deep space they are, and the matter paddle's previously constrained 200,000 light-year distance. But again, a lot of these things you have to overlook because it is a sitcom. But there are a lot of things that are also fun to theorize about. And again, like I said, I do view several elements of the novels as canon, and I probably think way more about the lore than anyone involved in the production of the show would ever intend. But Red Dwarf itself is fueled by sucking in hydrogen from space and converting it into fuel. One question that I had that my friend brought up to me when we were talking about it is how the hell do they still have food on the ship? Now, let's just assume that the food can be infinitely preserved. That's one assumption, right? I was like, okay, let's be generous and say they have that 11,169 crew number. And we're going on the novel's idea that the journey on the ship was supposed to take 4.5 years. These are all things that are established in Infinity Welcome's Careful Drivers. So we're just going to take them as canon because there's nothing directly contradicting it other than the ship crew number. But again, let's be generous here. And that number has changed in the show as well. So I thought, okay, they have enough food to last 11,000 people 4.5 years. I'm like, okay, that actually makes sense, right? They have food. But then I thought of something that was a pretty glaring issue in that thought process. The cat civilization evolved for 3 million years in the cargo hold, eating that food. So if they've been eating at it for 3 million years, there's no way in hell there'd be any food left, right? But we have seen things in the series that have a sort of matter synthesizer, things that can make things. For instance, Legion is able to synthesize food, and the matter paddle can be used to duplicate things. So it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility that their vending machines on Red Dwarf somehow create the food. Now you might say, well, how do they create it? Well, again, I mentioned earlier that the ship takes in hydrogen from space and converts it into fuel. Maybe a portion of that hydrogen is taken into some sort of matter converter that turns the hydrogen into whatever food is ordered from the vending machine. Maybe the vending machines harvest it and convert it into the food somehow. You see, that's one way to think of it working, because otherwise it really is confusing how they would have food aboard the ship after 3 million years, with the Cat Society having been on it and having obviously had to eat as well. I did think about doing this food theory as a dedicated video, but I didn't think it would be long enough to justify it because it's a pretty simple theory. So I decided to include it in this since I'm talking about lore, and Red Dwarf lore fascinates me. Like I said, it fascinates me far more than was probably intended. For instance, when you think about the implications of Infinity Welcome's Careful Drivers, and we take the elements of that that can be canon as canon, then Lister got drunk on his birthday, or what he assumed was his birthday, or celebrated as his birthday because he was found, and that's very clearly established in the books as well. He got drunk celebrating his birthday, and somehow ended up on Mimas, one of the moons of Saturn. And then he had no way back to Earth because all of his stuff was gone, but he ended up with the ID of someone else so that he could work there on Mimas. And so he started stealing taxis to try and make his money to get off Mimas. And then he met Rimmer, and Rimmer gave him the idea to join the Space Corps. He got aboard Red Dwarf, hearing it was bound for Earth, but then found out it actually wouldn't go to Earth for another 4.5 years. And then he actually gets himself intentionally put into stasis in that book. But the point is, Lister just got drunk one night and then got stranded in deep space because he has no way to get back home, and his way to get back home completely backfired and got him 3 million years away from Earth in both distance and time. But the fact is, the theory of him purposefully getting himself put into stasis, getting the cat just to get in trouble, that's one that I debate considering canon, because obviously if you watch the show, it's kind of implied that he got the cat because Kachansky broke up with him and he was feeling heartbroken. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's untrue that he was intentionally getting sent into stasis, because Kachansky making him heartbroken would make him depressed and make him want to get back to Earth sooner. So it would also make sense that that contributed to him getting Frankenstein and trying to get put into stasis. Again, there's no indication of this in the first episode of the show, The End, and there's also no indication of this in Ouroboros, which is the other episode that kind of touches on it. Nevertheless, it is interesting to think about because the novel makes it explicitly clear that Lister intentionally got himself sent to stasis. Then, of course, there's the question of, the Ace that appeared first in Dimension Jump. With the implications of the episode Stoke Me a Clipper, was the Ace who met them the original Ace? And if not, how much time passed? If this is the original Ace, and then the one that appears is like tons of Aces later, is time just completely different between dimensions? Does time not matter? I suppose it wouldn't, because Ace is from a timeline where he wouldn't be 3 million years in the future, right? That's another interesting thing to think about, is why did Ace end up with the crew of the Red Dwarf? Like, how did it send him that far in the future? Why didn't it send him to Rimmer when he was still alive on Red Dwarf, right? There's a lot of these things that are factors to think about. I think that it was absolutely the original Ace they met in the first appearance of him, but Stoke Me a Clipper does raise that question in your head. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is, how did he get propelled 3 million years in the future? And that's an excellent question. The answer? It's a sitcom. Don't pay attention to it. That's really the realistic answer. Maybe it has something to do with the way that the Dimension Drive works. I think it's called, like, Firefly Drive or something like that. I can't remember. I watched this episode just a few days ago, but I can't remember for certainly. I think it's like Firefly or something like that. Another thing that's interesting to think about is other contradictions. For instance, Lister remembers playing pool with planets in Demons and Angels. How does he remember that? That didn't happen, right? That didn't happen in this timeline, because they were in a redundant timeline after they sealed up the white hole. But then, in Mechocracy, Talkie Toaster's back. So, clearly, elements of that timeline happen, so did Lister play pool with planets again? I mean, he does play pool with planets in Better Than Life by launching the Earth into a black hole, but that's a little bit different because obviously that's the Earth, and that element obviously is not canon to the show, because in the show they have not returned to Earth with the exception of Backwards World, and obviously the fake Earth in Back to Earth. But obviously that's just a hallucination, although it does exist because that hallucination, they say, creates an actual universe, so our universe is actually a hallucination of them. But yeah, as I said, Red Dwarf and lore is a fun topic for me to talk about and get into, because I love to theorize things, I love to think about things and overanalyze them, hence this series. But obviously this is a sitcom that's all played for laughs, and none of the inconsistencies really matter. There's also ways to explain away with the time anomalies created through time slide, stasis leak, out of time, ticket or ride. There's all sorts of things that contribute to there potentially being timeline anomalies. There's also the fact that each season could theoretically take place in a different parallel universe, and we just wouldn't know it. It just has similar aspects. I hate to think of it that way, so I literally never do, because I like to think that the characters I'm seeing are the same characters, and that's a cop-out, but again, it is a sitcom. So at the end of the day, all this lore stuff is secondary to the comedy and the characters. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this somewhat rambly, all-over-the-place episode of OverAnalyzing. This has been Fugitive Red-Eye. Have a good one. Toodles.
What am I watching? I don't know, but I hate it.
I'm a Michael Jordan.
Michael Jackson's semen.
Fuck it.